Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next fireside chat. And today we are joined by a really dear friend and collaborator, Rick Doblin, who I'm sure everyone who is coming to this already knows, but he is the founder and president of MAPS and has been doing this work to kind of support creating legal contexts for psychedelics for the last 40 years. And he is really passionate about couple therapy and relationships. So we make a really good team on this agenda of moving forward MDMA-assisted couple therapy. So thank you for joining us, Rick.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I really do care about couples therapy a lot. I think it's so important.
Yeah. So let's kind of start there, maybe with a little bit of history. So, Rick, if you could share with us where MDMA started with couples before it was illegal and kind of when it became illegal, kind of what that process was a little bit.
Okay. Well, very briefly, MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912. They were not looking for anything from MDMA. It was just a compound on the way to get to another compound that they were trying to abate a competitor's patent to get to it. They didn't research it till 1927, and then when their patents were getting close to expiring, they did some animal studies, learned nothing of value, and abandoned it. They did more animal studies in 1959 and also found nothing and abandoned it. And then there was a drug called MDA, methylene dioxyamphetamine, that was popular during the 60s. And it's like a stronger version of MDMA, but it's more like an MDMA LSD combination. And that was used for it was called the love drug of America, the miracle drug of America also. So there was some use of that. But then in 1970, Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act, and then all sorts of psychedelics were criminalized, but they had to criminalize only things by name. So chemists could manufacture slight modifications and come up with legal things. So Sasha Shulgin, who's considered the godfather of MDMA, since the mid 60s, he was looking at different psychedelics, synthesizing them. And so he synthesized MDMA. And his approach to do this, so it really, I would say, began around 1976, was to take the drug himself. And then if he liked it, he would share it with his wife, Anne. And so you could say that the couples therapy began from the very beginning of
Mm.
MDMA. Then they had a small group of 12 people that met like once a month or so to test out new drugs. And they gave MDMA to this all group. And this group thought it was tremendously therapeutic potential, a lot of help that it could give to people. And then they passed it on to Leo Zeff. And Leo Zeff is called the secret chief. Was the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. He was a clinical psych PhD who thought that the laws were not just inappropriate, but immoral and counterproductive. And so he trained quite a few therapists and psychiatrists starting around 76, 77, 78. And couples therapy was one of the very first uses of MDMA. It was also used for PTSD, for people that were frightened of cancer, with other life-threatening illnesses, people with depression. It was explored in a large number of ways to treat large number of conditions. But then starting around 80 or so, it began to leak out into more recreational context. And there's a new documentary called The Prophet of Ecstasy. And it's about Michael Klieg, who began the Texas group that really created the name ecstasy and then made all these millions and millions of pills that they distributed in bars and nightclubs, particularly the Stark Club in Dallas, which attracted the attention of the police. I learned about MDMA in 1982, and I was at Esalen with a month-long workshop with Stan and Christina Groff, and it was called The Mystical Quest. And this is after 10 years of I'd done a workshop with Stan in 1972 and Joan Halifax when they were married. But I decided at that point when I was 18 to focus my life on psychedelics, but I realized I wasn't mature enough, capable enough. I had a lot of integration work to do. That took me about a decade. And then I go back to school in 1982. My first semester is a semester abroad at Esalen. And this woman, Debbie Harlow, comes by and says, "Hey, there's a new drug. It's called Atom, and it helps you feel love and it helps you feel connection." And It helps you be a better listener and really feels great. And I thought that's kind of interesting. I was used to large doses of LSD or mushrooms or mescaline where you have periods of time where you can't even really talk. So I saw a group of people sitting in a circle talking while they were on MDMA, and I like immediately thought this can't be very profound because they're
Mhm.
talking. How are they? Their ego's intact, they're rationalizing, they're listening. I'm like, you can't. So I like to say that I was stupid enough to underestimate it, but smart enough to buy some. And I took it home and I did it with my girlfriend. So my first use was MDMA for couples therapy in a way. And I'll just give one short illustration of why I found it to be so effective. So I was away from my girlfriend for a month at Esalen, and we were with a group of about 32 people or so for a month. It was a very incredible opportunity there. But there was this young woman who was also a part of this group, and there was nothing sexual between us, but we were attracted to each other in certain ways. And she asked me to sit for her for LSD trip. And so I said, sure. We did that on the weekends where it wasn't really authorized as part of the formal program during the week. We would do that off the property. So I sat for her for LSD, and it's kind of an intimate thing to sit for someone when they're
Yeah.
taken apart with psychedelics. So she gave me this gold necklace as a present afterwards. All right, so I come home from being away for a month with a gold necklace from another woman. And under the influence of MDMA, my girlfriend and I were able to just talk about it so clearly without any kind of, reactivity in a way. And I was able to just to explain, now this wasn't a sexual thing, but it was just a really nice thing. And it just felt like I was operated and we were both operating at a better, higher level than we
Mm.
normally did. We were less defensive. And I started to understand what Debbie had said when it's a big advantage that this drug, it really does make an enormous difference in your ability to communicate, to be less defensive. I'd say the main thing, if I would describe what MDMA does, is self-acceptance.
Mhm.
You just settle in, you're fine with you as the way you are. And so when you're with a partner and somebody might have something kind of critical information to share, you can hear it without the usual defensiveness. So it just was phenomenal. So from that point, I realized that there was going to be a backlash because it was being sold in sort of party settings that were attracting the attention of the government. But the government didn't know about the therapy use, but the therapists and the people using it knew that the government was interested in the recreational use. So I started a nonprofit before MAPS in 1984 to try to protect MDMA. And that was really an exciting opportunity to start to be political. And we knew that it was good for couples therapy, that it was good for PTSD. In particular, I had talked to a Vietnam vet who had been shot in the back, and he had some bullet fragments still in his lower back, and he had a lot of pain there. But under MDMA, he sort of relived the battle where he was shot and released a lot of the difficult emotions from that. And then the pain in his back went down. It didn't go away completely.
Mm.
Now, so it's sort of like physical and emotional pain wrapped together. And he worked on the emotional pain. So then it became clear that we were winning in the courts, winning in the court of public opinion. We had rabbis saying MDMA is like the Sabbath, Roman Catholic monks using half doses in the monastery for meditation, talking about how a monk spends his entire life trying to reach the enlightened attitude you can get with MDMA. And these are people willing to speak to the media. And Lester Grinspoon from Harvard Medical School, one of the top psychiatrists in America. And so what happened is in 1985, while the court cases are going on, the DEA freaked out. We could say the DEA had a bad trip because they were losing. And they emergency scheduled MDMA on the basis of some very dubious research about MDMA causing neurotoxicity. And so that was 1985. Later, we won the case. We won a couple of times in the appeals court, but the DEA rejected the recommendation that MDMA stay available as a medicine, but be illegal for recreational use. And then I realized that the only way through was through the FDA. So that's where I started MAPS in 86, and with the plan to be a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company. And so while I knew that MDMA was great for couples therapy, I also knew that couples therapy wasn't diagnosable disorder. And we also needed to have sympathetic patients. And so the one that we chose initially was cancer patients who had a short term to live, who were fearful of dying, because that way that would get us over this whole idea of neurotoxicity. Because the supposed claim was, oh, we don't see any problems now, but we're going to have all sorts of problems in the future. These brain damage that people have, they're going to. So that was clever, that we don't see problems, but there will be problems in the future. So we thought, okay, we'll work with people who don't have a future, basically. And we had 5 different protocols rejected by the FDA from 86 to 92. And then we finally, the people at the FDA who regulated psychedelics shifted in 1990 to a new group that was open to research with psychedelics. And in 1992, they had this formal meeting to look at our MDMA cancer patient protocol. And what they basically said was that it was time to resume human research, but they would hold psychedelics to the same standards they hold big pharma. And so in the room was the drug czar's office, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the DEA. And when they heard FDA say, we're going to hold these psychedelics to the same standards as big pharma, everybody else got the DEA, NIDA, they got really relaxed because they thought nothing will ever come out the other end. So they agreed. And then the FDA said, okay, we can do work with a phase 1 dose response safety study. All the information that was gathered before then from either both legal and then post legal underground didn't count at all because it wasn't conducted under FDA. So we had to do phase 1 dose response safety study. So that's how everything began. And then near the end of the 90s, Charlie Grove, who I was working with, did the phase 1 dose response safety study at Harbor, UCLA, not far from where you guys are. He has a higher risk aversion, you could say, than I do, or a lower risk tolerance. So by the end of the 90s, what happened was that MDMA was becoming ecstasy. It was becoming a party drug. It was being used all over the world. The reputation was incredibly widespread as far as how great it was for parties. It was big into Ibiza and nightclubs in England and stuff. So Charlie said that he would focus on psilocybin. He said, people don't even know
Hmm.
what psilocybin is, so I'll do psilocybin for cancer patients. And then in 2000, I met up with Michael Mithoefer, our lead psychiatrist, and he said he wanted to do work with PTSD. And I said, that is great. That's really sympathetic patients. And so that's how that whole began. And now I would say all these years later, it's a delight to be returning to couples therapy because it gives us an incredible opportunity in tune with the times to try to refocus from treating illness to sort of enhancing wellness. And so we have lawyer scientists that we work with who specialize in disputes with the FDA. And we've won 2 already. We're 2 out of 2 in suing the FDA. One was about our MDMA project, where we wanted to give MDMA to therapists. The previous FDA people had done that as part of their training, but this new group at the FDA said, no, we're not going to give you permission for that. Plus, your people are unqualified. They need to be MD PhDs as a lead therapist. You need a doctor on site. All of this was poison pill for the industry. So we won on all those things. Then we won on the marijuana issue where they didn't want us. We have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to do cannabis for PTSD and 320 veterans. It's palliative, not curative, but it's still worth studying, and a lot of people use it. And the FDA didn't want us to study smoked or vaporized or patient self-titration. We won on those. And the lawyers that we worked with have said that they look forward to challenging the FDA about MDMA for couples therapy because the FDA has only approved drugs to treat illness, but the law that created the FDA does not specifically limit them to approving only things for illness. And I would say, to borrow a word from the tech world, the killer app, I would say the killer app for MDMA is couples therapy.
Hmm.
So it's tremendous to be able to work with you to try to bring that forward, initially in an academic way. Then we see what kind of results we get, and then we challenge the FDA. So there's another little part about how did the work begin with couples therapy, and I'll just briefly say that, which is that starting in 1995, I realized that we needed to work with veterans. We needed sympathetic veterans. There was loads of people there who had PTSD from Vietnam. And so I kept offering the VA money and MDMA and stuff. We would help them do research. And the therapists and doctors at the VA who were in touch with the patients knew that more was needed, but it was always squashed by the political people. So every 5 years, we tried a different VA, and I tried that 3 different times and got rejected all those times. And then through great good fortune, I met Richard Rockefeller, who was a doctor from the Rockefeller family, but he'd been experimenting with ayahuasca and he was really interested in psychedelics. And so he came to me and he said, "What's your biggest problem?" And I said, "It's the VA." He wanted to help with the biggest problem. And his cousin was Senator Jay Rockefeller on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. It had a family feud. They had not spoken for years because Jay is from West Virginia, and that's where they have a lot of coal, and he had to defend coal in the Rockefeller family who made all their money on oil, whereas the new generations divested all from oil, and they wanted to atone, in a way, you could say, for what they've done for the climate. So Richard and Jay hadn't spoken for years, but because we were trying to do work with the VA, Richard overcame this family feud and reached out to Jay, and Jay said he would help us. And he started speaking to the Department of Defense, to the head of the VA, writing letters. And finally, in 2014, with Paula Schnur at the National Center for PTSD, they agreed that they would review data from a study with some of their researchers. This was Candace Monson and Ann Wagner. Candace, who developed cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy at the Boston VA. Conjoint means couples or dyads. So the primary outcome measure is the vet with PTSD, but they bring their partner in, and then you have all of these relationship measures and things like that. So they'd heard of MDMA, the love drug, and they thought, oh, okay, this is couples work. Maybe you can do that. But they said, we're not going to let you do this in a VA. We're not going to refer any vets to you. We're not going to pay for it. You have to pay for it. And the researchers have to use their academic affiliations, not their VA affiliations, but we'll look at the results. And so we did a pilot study with 6 dyads with Candace and Ann. And so Michael and Annie Midover went through their training in cognitive behavior conjoint therapy. Candace and Ann went through our training in MDMA, and the results were great, better than anything they ever got, with both reduction of PTSD and strength of the relationship. So from there, we moved to Ann Wagner in Toronto doing a study of 15 couples with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy compared to 15 couples getting cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy with MDMA. So that study is underway. MAPS helped fund that. And then finally, there was the opportunity to do a study that you guys worked on at the San Diego VA. But there was something frustrating to me about that, which was, for different political reasons, I would say, it only felt comfortable to the people at the San Diego VA to give MDMA to the vet, but not the non-vet partner. So it wasn't actually couples therapy. And now we've raised money at the Phoenix VA to do MDMA with cognitive behavior conjoint therapy. The vet and the non-vet partner will get MDMA. We had to go all the way up to Dennis McDonough, who was the secretary of the VA, to get his personal approval. And then we got this agreement that you could bring in the non-vet partner. So then there's a study at Sunstone Therapeutics, which is in Rockville, Maryland. It's cancer patients with adjustment disorder and a significant other. So they give MDMA to both members of the couple, the cancer patient with adjustment disorder, and the results have been really great for almost all the couples there. And so the culmination of all of this work is now your study, where it will be couple therapy without a diagnosis. And it's just it's taken 40 years basically to get to this point. And this is like this new launching point to sort of be in line with the trend to not just focus on illness, but to focus on wellness, to focus on preventative medicine. So that's why it's so delightful. But I also think that when you talk about how do you get mainstreaming, how do you get social acceptance, the key for us was sympathetic patients. That was the veterans. That's how we got bipartisan support. But everybody cares about their relationships. And so if we can show that MDMA can be really helpful for couples in distress, I think you just win over hearts and minds of everybody.
Yeah.
So that's
Thank you for that 40-year summary in this brief amount of time that we have to get us started.
Incredible. I gotta say, if anybody is still concerned about potential neurotoxicity of MDMA or other psychedelics, they should spend 10 minutes talking to you, because I dream of having your like level of just knowledge and being able to you're so impressive.
Thank you, Kat. But I should say that the FDA has completely abandoned concerns about neurotoxicity.
Yes.
We don't hear one word from them about neurotoxicity anymore. I was just in Paris at an addiction conference, and Nora Volko, who's the head of NIDA, was there with her husband. And I got to have dinner with them. And what I was just sharing is that they were the source of anti MDMA propaganda for a really long time. But that sort of ended around the time she took over. And so, yeah, it's just, and they acknowledge, even the National Institute on Drug Abuse doesn't talk about neurotoxicity anymore.
I think for most of our listeners, they probably have some experience with MDMA. But for anyone who doesn't, the reason why it is so helpful for couple therapy and for trauma is because couples typically coming to couple therapy are stuck in some dysfunctional pattern. They've experienced some betrayal, or even Rick, like you were describing with your experience, there was just a topic that was kind of challenging that would bring up some defensiveness or some walls. And MDMA kind of floods our brain with serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin and vasopressin. So we feel very safe. And then with trauma or betrayal or challenging topics that would typically kind of put our walls up or make us avoid, we're able to still really stay in that space, be present, accept ourselves and our partner. We experience a lot of self-love and compassion. And so we can move through these places. We can reprocess experiences that feel very painful in a way that actually leads to kind of healing and connection. And yeah, there's been, go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to say, Shannon, exactly what you described is why it's one of the most popular recreational drugs in the world. Even if you're not doing it in a therapy way, what they said
Totally.
when MDMA really started big in the rave movement in the clubs in England, this was in the basically early 90s and throughout the 90s. And this one, there was a lot of violence between Catholics and Protestants. And they said that they could get together. The only place they really got together was on the dance floor with ecstasy. And at the same time, there was all this, we didn't see it now, fortunately, but there's soccer violence. So the World Cup didn't show it. But in England, the soccer clubs, people get drunk and they go and they beat each other up. And that was a really big part of what was going on with these soccer clubs or football clubs, as they call them in England. But once MDMA started being used widespread, the violence went way down. So it had kind of a magnifying effect in culture. What we're talking about happens with individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is also like so shocking why we would want to remove something from society that leads to kind of more connection and understanding and healing on like, seems like you should actually maybe have it in communities more. Yeah. I wanted to touch on one thing that you were talking about with the San Diego study where Kayla and I were both co-investigators. So as Rick described, there's been 4 trials with couples. There was that first study with Michael and Annie Mithofer and Candice Monson and Ann Wagner, and both couples did the MDMA sessions, or both people did the MDMA session. Same thing with Sunstone and then Ann's crossover. There is, so at the San Diego VA, the principal investigator is Leslie Moreland. They did single dosing. We did single dosing. And initially, that was kind of system based, right? In the VA, the veteran is only allowed to get medicine. Same thing with like Advil or Tylenol. You can't give that to a partner. But as we were kind of running the protocol and learning, there was only one partner that even would have been able or willing to take MDMA because there were other health complications or job complications. And so having a single dosing model, I think, is very important as we are expanding so we can increase access. The couple still did the entire couple therapy together. So they were doing the therapy that Rick was talking about, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD. So the couple does the psychoed on PTSD. They learn communication skills, and then they do the conjoint thought challenging around PTSD related thoughts. They do preparation and integration. And then during the medicine session, the veteran takes MDMA and the partner comes for the last couple of hours so that it still feels very much like a shared experience. And so the benefit of having that is that we can have multiple models. We can have single dosing models. We can have dual dosing models. And then all of these studies did 2 MDMA sessions, and we can talk a little bit more about the Anamri study in a bit, but we're planning to do 3 MDMA sessions there. So there will be kind of different learning with that. Kayla, I'm glad you are back.
Hi.
I'm curious if you could share a little bit about the published case study from the San Diego VA, a little bit about what that couple was experiencing and how MDMA supported kind of healing in that context for that couple.
Yeah, so this is a case study from the clinical trial that was run out of the San Diego, excuse me, not a clinical trial, the pilot study that was run out of the San Diego VA. The principal investigator on it was Leslie Moreland, and you can find this published paper in Google Scholar, I'm sure. So we wanted to write up this case study because impact of the MDMA-assisted therapy on this patient, this PTSD patient who was a female veteran, and her partner was really profound. It really stuck with me. I think about it often, and it stuck with, I think, all of us, and was a really good example of the power of this treatment. And Rick, I'm reminded of what you said earlier on at least the part of the call that I was on. Sorry, I just moved, and so my internet is still figuring
All
itself out.
good.
Is it the self-compassion, right? The
Yeah.
way that it
Yes.
allows us to connect with our sense of self-love and self-forgiveness. And that was so relevant for this veteran who had PTSD that was related to, she had sort of a complex PTSD presentation, a long history of childhood abuse, and then a domestic violence incident along with some military sexual trauma, which is, I wish I could say that was a less common presentation with my former work at the VA, but that was so common, right? With VA patients, especially female veterans. And she carried so much shame and so much self-blame and so much pain related to these traumatic experiences, right? That she had lived through. And of course, I think it's easy for us from the outside to go, of course, that wasn't your fault. But, she's really kind of reflecting on, how what are the choices that I made in my life that, made it so that I experienced all of this pain and all of this suffering, right? And she had a really hard time forgiving herself for that and carried a lot of anger toward herself that would sort of come out in explosions toward her partner and toward her daughter, which of course just reinforced more shame. Right. And it was really amazing to watch in these 2 MDMA therapy sessions. And I should say at the VA, in this particular study, we were only giving MDMA to the veteran patient, not to their partner. So we're really eager to do more work. And I know some others are doing more work looking at designs with MDMA going to both partners. But with her MDMA sessions, a couple of really incredible things happened. One, she began to tell the story of her traumatic experiences out loud. She said for the first time in her whole life, other than when she made the police report. And if anybody has ever had to report an assault or something to the police, it's not always the most affirming and validating experience. So that was not a good experience for her. And so she said she experienced a sense of profound relief and empowerment from getting to tell this story out loud. This was really notable to us, the study team, because we're like PTSD treatment researchers. And what we know about PTSD treatment generally is that one of the mechanisms that makes it work is that we can sort of desensitize ourselves to the trauma narrative. And one really effective way of doing that is saying it out loud. So there's lots of PTSD treatments that center around telling our trauma story. But we didn't tell her to do that. That was not a part of this treatment protocol. It came up spontaneously. And she told the story, and then she told it again later in a way that my co-therapist, who is the study PI at Leslie Moreland, we were looking at each other kind of going like, she's like doing prolonged exposure therapy all by herself. Like she's just sort of doing it and walking herself through it. This is that sort of inner healer, right? And she experienced the sense of relief and the sense of empowerment and ownership over her own story. And then subsequent to that was able to, with very little input from the therapists in the room, walk herself through this progression of understanding that it wasn't her fault and being able to forgive herself and being able to have some self-compassion for it. And that fundamentally shifted how she showed up as a mom and as a partner. and as like a person, her relationship with herself, right? So it was just so profound to see the way that this sort of shifted her. And again, I really encourage folks to go find this case report. It was a really fun one to write up and just really fascinating work.
Well, I just wanted to add one point, which is that Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score and is working on a new book, he was the principal investigator of our site in Boston. But he was not with us in phase 2, he just started in phase 3, and he said, "Don't work with people like you've just described that have complex PTSD, because they've never had a strong attachment, they're the hardest people to treat, it won't work if you treat them." And we said, "No, in phase 2, we've treated a lot of people with complex PTSD, and so we're gonna include them." So Bessel said, "All right, but if you're gonna include them, I want you to add some measures so that I can look at sort of the psychodynamics of what's going on." And the key measure he wanted to add was a self-compassion scale. And so he ended up, after the study was over, acknowledging that it works better in those people with complex PTSD because they've never had that sense of attachment. And if you can give them something like that with MDMA, they're so hungry for that.
Hmm.
So he published this paper. I'd really encourage people to look at it too, but it's really highlights this idea of self-compassion because I think we're easier forgiving other people than ourselves.
Yeah.
And so I think particularly when it comes to perpetrators of all different kinds. So you could have a couple's relationship where somebody was potentially, violent, abusive, whatever. And so I think this self-compassion, especially for perpetrators, or to use a more general, milder word, the people that caused a breach in the relationship of whatever kind, a breach of trust or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that self-compassion part is really critical, and, that was in Plus One, Bessel's paper.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
Kayla's talking about kind of this veteran that has PTSD and has experienced trauma, but I think also kind of everyone listening, if we just look at like humans, right? Every human has a story, every human has pain, every human has caused some amount of pain, and this is going to show up in our relationship, whether it's trauma or family history or attachment or infidelity. And it's really hard to, as Rick is saying, kind of look at yourself in that and the pain that you have potentially caused. And without healing that piece also, like we can't show up as an engaged partner with love and if we're not actually kind of like loving and having compassion for ourselves and forgiving ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to speak too to the importance for this patient and for many like her of having their partners be part of their treatment. Rick, as you're saying, like she had not really experienced this capacity to opening herself up to secure attachment, like at any point in her life. And even though her partner did not participate in the MDMA experience with her, which like if he had been able to, that probably would have been even better. But like even without that, the fact that he was there supporting her, it gave her one, the courage to face down the things that were really scary for her to face, and two, the ability to like include him in these major shifts that she was making. One of the things that we sometimes hear from families, spouses, partners of people who do really profound psychedelic experiences, like folks who go receive ibogaine treatment, who receive, ayahuasca ceremonies, it can be really difficult for their families when they come back, right? Because this person has experienced this profound shift, but the family system didn't get to be part of that, right? Like their spouse was excluded from that. And so it can be a difficult adjustment. And that's one of the reasons why Chandra and I really love working with couples and are so passionate about working at the relational level, because if that's our primary attachment system, which it is for most adults, we need to be including that system in our healing work, right? And so I'm really excited about opportunities to do more of that.
Yeah, I guess now is the point where I do have a question for both of you, which is that you currently do ketamine-assisted couples therapy. So I'm wondering if you could speak to how you think it would be similar or different to do ketamine-assisted couples therapy as compared to MDMA-assisted couples therapy.
Yeah. So with ketamine, similarly, couples are right coming in stuck in some dysfunctional pattern. And so ketamine is a dissociative. it can kind of pull us out of the pattern. And so we're able to see that pattern, which is what we're trying to do in couple therapy. We're actually trying to see the pattern as kind of separate from us. So the couple and the therapist are working together to kind of shift this pattern rather than being stuck in the pattern. So ketamine's really helpful at that, kind of pulling us into this observer perspective. And then ketamine also similarly has a lot of like cognitive flexibility and openness and empathy. They're a little bit different in like what the medicine session actually looks like. So a ketamine medicine session is going to be about 3 hours. With an MDMA session, we're carving out 6 to 8 hours. And a ketamine session, if you're doing a psychedelic dose, it's going to be inward focused. So the couple is focused inward with headphones and an eye mask for about an hour and a half. And then we come out and we start to do integration. If you're doing a psycholytic dose, which is about half, then the couple will go in for about 20 minutes, including the kind of swish and spit. If you're doing sublingual, IM's a little bit different. But then we pull them out of the medicine and start to do relational work while they're still kind of under the medicine. And that can look a little bit more similar to an MDMA session, but that's only going to be about 45 minutes to an hour. An MDMA session, they're going to be doing a lot of inner work and outer work. So the couple will have headphones and eye mask in an MDMA session, and they'll kind of move between going in and exploring their patterns and hurt and those stuck places and coming out and sharing with their partner and connecting. And that will go on for the entire MDMA session. With both, you're going to do prep and integration, and it's going to kind of flow. We're seeing this in Anne Wagner's study. It'll kind of flow back into a course of couple therapy. Anne is getting to explore this in her compassionate crossover. So after the CBCT, then they can do couple therapy. So she's kind of exploring this. So those are some of the differences. I think as Kayla and I think about when MDMA is legal and we get to do this with couples and we have options, I think really like one of the major things that will be the deciding factor is like, what is accessible to this couple? Do they have a full day to carve out? And then we think of MDMA a little bit more like emotional surgery, like it's a big session and you're going deep, and you are also, ketamine is also a very deep experience, but like you could do it like after work. You could come at 4 and we could be there from 4 to 7, and then we'll meet the next morning for integration. And so there's different logistical challenges. If there is this like stuck couple pattern, ketamine's great. If there is like a deep betrayal or like loss, I think I would probably go MD.
And
And
then there's in the future, there are methadone, 3-MMC, other kind of
yes,
things that are milder versions of MDMA that are a little
Totally.
bit shorter that
yes.
you might use sometimes instead of ketamine or so.
Absolutely.
But I do want to share how important I think this couples therapy work is to the future of men. And I'll explain
Mm,
why. So I just had a conversation with 2 women last night. One of them was talking about this new research about how lesbian couples can have a baby. And that what they're saying is that you are able to, without any kind of men involved, you're able to take certain kind of cells and turn them back into stem cells. And then from one of these stem cells, you can get sperm and presumably these women would have eggs. And so you can completely, they're saying in the future, you may be able, the human race may be able to be completely reproducible without men. And then one of the women turned to me and said, once we figure this out, we're going to get rid of all the men. And I was like, so I'm just saying that I think with the progression of science, we need to really build the strength to have healthy relationships.
I
mhm.
could not agree more,
Yeah.
Rick. And can I soapbox on this for a minute? Here's the thing. For a really long time, the primary role of men in relationships has been structural access to economic power, to social power, to like financial resources, right? That has been the role of men in relationships, and men did that well for a really long time. And we've now shifted, right? Where women don't need men for that anymore. So the expectation of men in relationships has shifted. Men are expected to be able to show up as equal emotional partners, as sort of from the same kind of like social functions as women have historically gotten from their female friendships and female family members. And I think we do a piss poor job of supporting men in actually learning the skills to do that in their relationships. When we see couple therapy clients, a lot of the time I'm having especially when it's a male female partnership, I am having conversations with the men about like, look, your spouse is expecting things of you that you never learned how to do, right? You at no point in your life got taught how to have an emotionally vulnerable conversation. In fact, most men grow up thinking that emotionally vulnerable conversations are invasive and disrespectful and rude. And so we have to correct that, right? And the reality is you got to learn now or she's going to divorce you. So here are your choices. I don't want men to become superfluous. I think men have,
I'm glad to
I
hear
think
that.
people of all genders have a tremendous amount to contribute to our world. And we need to be able to support people in learning the social emotional skills, right? And 100%, Rick, I agree with you that I think MDMA and other psychedelics are a fabulous way to support people in being able to make contact with sort of those vulnerable places.
Okay, so since we're not staying away from controversial topics, let me ask you about rites of passage. So I think I was very intellectual, I guess, very very much in my head, you could say, as I was growing up, and I had this whole situation in high school where I was scared to talk to a girl, and I really was super shy. And I think if I would have had MDMA when I was 13, and I would have understood what an emotion is and been more able to be in touch with my own feelings, I would have been able to have more healthy communications. So how do you see this education that you're talking about to help men feel things that they've never felt before? When do you think those should start, that education?
You love this. This is your favorite topic.
Yes.
I think we need to be really mindful of the neurobiological development of the brain, right? And there's a lot that we don't know yet about so psychedelics broadly are neuroplastogens, right? So they like increase neuroplasticity in the brain. And we know that that kind of brain development is already going on like crazy, right, during adolescence. And so that would be my only concern. There's nothing magical about age 18 in that all of a sudden now you're ready for like profound life experiences and you were not at age 17 and a half, right? Like that's clearly an arbitrary age that we've selected. And I don't know, maybe the right age for psychedelics is actually 30 because that's when your prefrontal cortex is done. Who knows?
Well,
But
I wonder though, Rick, if you would have been like in therapy with me or Kayla
uh,
talking about your desire to have relationships and interest in people and where you're feeling stuck and where you avoid. Like, I wonder if that also would have potentially made a difference
well,
at that
I'm
age.
sure that would have helped, but I do think, Kayla, that the narrative that you just gave, I think, is used to justify the drug war. So whenever I hear,
mm,
"Oh, the brains don't fully develop till 25," or now you're even saying 30 for the prefrontal cortex, that's been used as saying, "Oh, we gotta protect people's brains, and therefore they should never try marijuana, that should be illegal, they
sure.
should never try any of these things." And so my feeling is that if you can layer in open to emotions, the earlier the better, because brains are developing. And so the earlier that you can sort of help people feel some of this self-compassion or this understanding of their emotions. So I actually think more like 12 or 13, where traditional rites of passage are, where would be, a good age, but
I think we need structure around it, right? Rick, I actually
Yeah,
am
community
like
support.
more I lean more your direction, but I'm also like the fast and loose one of an Emery. But I think like we anecdotally, right? I have lots of friends that started experimenting with things in middle school and high school. And like I've seen people go lots of different directions, right? I've seen people develop into these very thoughtful, curious, deeply emotional people. And I've seen people kind of like spiral and we lose them. So I
Yeah.
think we need more research on like what is actually happening, what is the right age, what is the right structure and integration to actually have meaningful changes based on these experiences. So I don't think it's as easy as like, what is the right age? Like, I think we need to understand the system that we're creating. And same thing with doing psychedelics now, right? Couples can go off and have it. We were talking with Tommaso about this in our last fireside. Like, there's lots of couples that have a psychedelic experience and then have this like deep commitment based on the psychedelic experience and actually get into these kind of like coercive, manipulative relationships because they want to stay because there's so much commitment, but it actually isn't a healthy relationship dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you are doing it in therapy and there's integration, like we can notice these patterns and we can learn from them in a different way and we can grow in a different way. So the psychedelic experience on its own could be wonderful and could be detrimental depending on how you're actually integrating and what you're learning.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would completely agree with you. Yeah, that the debate should not be about what age, unless somebody says, "Oh, don't do it till you're 30." It's more about
I'm not saying that, by the
I
way.
know, I
I
know.
I actually I am a decrim legalize across the
Yeah,
board person. I don't think we need to
yeah,
be protecting people from themselves. I do think that we should make our choices with full information. That's all I'm saying.
yeah, and for sure. And I think the context, Chandra, that's the
Yeah.
key. Is
Yeah.
is whether you can somehow or other, make a benefit out of it or have it be harmful. It's not so much the age as the context. And I think,
Absolutely.
for people that are traumatized, there's even more of an argument to treat them sooner rather than later. So
Sure.
Yep.
there's actually 2 studies that are moving in this direction. One is at UCLA with 18 to 22-year-olds receiving MDMA therapy for PTSD from childhood trauma, and the other at Harvard at McLean Hospital. Also 18 to 22-year-olds with
Yeah, it's going to be cool.
trauma stemming from, yeah, so both of those are sort of laying the groundwork to working with younger people, but that's also in a very therapeutic context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But I do
absolutely.
wish that I would have had MDMA when I was 12 or 13, and I
For
would have
sure.
had a way better time in high school.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure
Yeah.
a lot of people feel that same way. Chandra, do we want to take a couple of questions from the chat?
Yeah, I am aware of time. So we have about 4 minutes left.
I
I
could sit
also,
longer if you want.
the two, Kayla, you and Rick can. I have a patient. But I would love for the two of you to chat more about the Anamri study. And there's still people watching. We also we just launched our first fundraiser this morning. So you can see it on our page. It's just like a little to get us started. We have a long way to go, but you can see it on our page and you'll be able to see it on Rick's page after this. So people can see that. So we can talk about a little bit about what the foundation does. So Kayla, do you have any time after this?
Yeah, I can definitely stay on. Yeah, one of the
Okay.
unfortunate implications of the war on drugs is that because of all of the legal and regulatory stuff as a result of that, research with psychedelics is very expensive to do. So if you want to see this research come to fruition, consider making a little donation to us or any of the other researchers who are fundraising for this. Okay, we have a question that says from somebody who's watching, I research couples who take MDMA recreationally. If there is one question you could ask these couples that might push forward the work going on with MDMA couples therapy, what would it be?
My question would be, are you willing to speak more in public and to your
Mm,
family members and to others about what your experience was? Because there is so much propaganda, so much we talked about the neurotoxicity scares, but people don't know what to believe a lot. And if you've been educated by the DARE program about how all these drugs have only they're the unique drugs according to DARE because they only have harms and no benefits, but that people respond to stories that they hear from people that they know.
yeah.
So I would really encourage people if they have had some of these experiences, even if they weren't helpful, just to share that with others, why they tried it, what it was like, what they thought maybe it could be done differently so it was helpful. So I think that would be my main question.
Yeah, I agree. I think a huge part of this next step for psychedelics is education and actually seeing people who look like you and feel like you and have like an understanding so that there's not this kind of like separate, it happens in research or it happens in dark clubs underground. Like it is actually people just like you who are struggling in their relationships, who are struggling with trauma. And I think the more people can feel connected to stories, I completely agree, Rick. That education's really helpful.
Yep. Same. We've seen that with any sort of stigmatized behavior or identity that the more people come out, the more people talk about it, the more public acceptance, the more like misinformation gets corrected, right? Yeah. We have another question about somebody who's curious about MDMA for end of life anxiety. And Rick, I
Uh,
wonder if you could share a little bit more. Does MDMA look as promising as psilocybin for end of life anxiety? How does this compare?
I would say they're promising in different ways. So psilocybin is a more internal, experience, and you kind of can feel your ego dissolving. You can feel part of something larger, and in some ways that can help you relax your fear of death. That you're still part of something. And there's been billions of years of evolution. So I think that we have done a study with MDMA for end of life anxiety, and the results were really good. But I would say that there's a unique property for MDMA that I've done this a couple times in underground settings a long time ago with people days away from dying.
Mm,
And these were people that were, all three of them were people that were on pain meds for cancer. So they were just incredibly tranquilized because they were in such pain because they were so close to dying. And the opiates for pain make you sleepy. It's almost like you're not really there. But when you add MDMA on top of that, you get synergistic, better pain control than opiates alone. So the
interesting.
opiates and the MDMA give this better pain control, plus the stimulant properties of MDMA overwhelm the sort of sedative properties of the opiates so that you're there. And unlike psilocybin, it's not so much an internal trip when you're doing it this way, but you're with your loved ones and you're able to sort of recapitulate your relationship and talk about how wonderful or anything about how it was and sort of say your final goodbyes. So I think that that's the area that will be researched the least because people in hospice contexts like that are on so many other drugs. We don't know all about the drug-drug interactions. So there has been research on the other side of this, I think particularly closer to somebody getting a diagnosis when they have to think about chemo or they have to think about radiation or just going through these really difficult situations. There's also a lot of people that, particularly with breast cancer, where it can recur. And so people who've been had breast cancer but then are cured, there's still a lot of anxiety about when it will come back. So I think that MDMA for end of life anxiety is somewhat similar to working with PTSD. It's like you're able to confront these fears. And what we've seen with MDMA is that people can refocus away from the sadness of the time they're not going to have to the celebration of the time that they do have. And there was one person in particular, this was a friend of mine's father, and she worked with him, months before he died. And under the influence of MDMA, he had been for quite a long time denying the fact that he was dying. And, he wouldn't do the treatments, but he was always kind of anxious. And so under the MDMA, he kind of came to peace to the fact that he was dying. And then he recognized that if he refocuses on just the time that he has left, he should take the most advantage of that. And what he was worried about was that if he accepts the reality of impending death, that somehow he's going to die sooner. And that his denial of death was, in his mind, initially connected to survival. If I deny that this is really happening, but I'm fearful and anxious all this time, somehow I will able to live longer. And then under the MDMA, he realized that if he enjoyed the time that he had, however limited, and took advantage of it, that he actually would probably live longer. And he did actually outlive the projections of his doctors. So I think that MDMA and end of life anxiety is one of the very best uses of MDMA. But not everybody's going to, and we all are going to die from something. But I do think that the couples therapy work has a more general applicability than even working with the end of life.
I'm
Bye,
going to jump to
Chandra.
go
Good
see my
session.
patient. Thank you so much, Rick, for joining us. And yeah, I will catch up with you two later. Bye.
Great, great.
Rick, next question for you. This is a question that folks ask us a lot, which is given sort of, let's imagine everything is legal and we can sort of have free choice in what medicine, what drug to use with what kind of concern. Do you have an opinion on to what extent we will continue to sort of like prioritize MDMA for couple therapy versus ketamine versus psilocybin versus some of the other ones that you had mentioned, methadone, MDA? What are your thoughts on sort of how we might think about different applications for couple therapy and different medicines for couple therapy?
Okay. Well, I would say that the future, as I see it, should be therapists cross-trained in all these different drugs. So, 5-MeO-DMT or DMT or ayahuasca, ibogaine, MDMA, methadone, 3-MMC, psilocybin, mescaline, so that then the therapist will sort of work with the patient, figure out what their history is also, and sort of select what they think is the most appropriate. The other thing is that the research that's all being done, like you described, the study at an Emory will be 3 MDMA sessions.
Yes.
But I could easily imagine a situation where you get an MDMA experience, and then your second one is psilocybin or ketamine, and then your third one is back to MDMA. So we won't even have treatments, I think, that are like one drug for one thing. I think that you have different angles. So I like to think of psychedelics like colors of the rainbow, and they're all options. They're all beautiful in their own way, and you just choose which goes right. But all of that said, I do think that MDMA is particularly good for couples therapy. And so when I've done methadone, when I've done 3-MMC, I think they definitely have their uses. There was a
Hmm.
study that was done with methadone with PTSD in phase 2. They got good results. And the company was sold to Otsuka, the Japanese pharmaceutical company, for $1.23 billion from only phase 2 data
Wow.
about methadone for PTSD. And methadone is not as good as MDMA for PTSD. That was one of the advantages because then you keep needing to buy more methadone.
Mm.
You need more treatments. So pharma companies like that. So I think that when Chandra was talking about shorter acting ketamine and you can do it from 4 to 7 in the evening or something like that, I think that there will be some people where that makes the most sense. I think that there will be some people where you don't want to get as long of an experience, or, with MDMA in particular, we have usually an 8-hour experience. We use a supplemental dose to make it longer. You may not want to use that. You may just do an initial dose, but we do half the initial dose between 1.5 and 2.5 hours to make it into an 8-hour session.
Hmm.
But we say to people that it's really a 2-day experience. The second day to rest, to
Yes.
reflect, to do the integration work. You're not as tired with methadone or 3-MMC. So they're better in some way party drugs. They don't go quite as deep. You're not as tired the next day,
Yeah.
but I think they will have their applications. So I think it's only going to be over time through research. But I want to say to everybody who's listening, and to you, Kayla, how tremendous it is that you're the only study that's going to be looking at couples therapy where nobody has a diagnosis. I mean, maybe you will do that with ketamine at one point as well, but I think that we don't really have the data to respond to that question. We just have our anecdotal experiences and what we've seen, and
Right.
but my sort of sense is that if you're in a troubled relationship, you certainly have time to give to it if you want to. And so I don't know that we really need to find these shorter acting things that aren't quite as deep or as good. And so when I've taken methadone or 3-MMC, at some point I'm like, God, I feel this is really, really good. It's helpful, but I wish, that it was a little bit deeper. I felt that in both of those times. So I think there's benefits from all of these different substances, but my guess is over time we may settle on MDMA, or who knows, somebody may develop some new drug.
True. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I that's my answer to this question too, is largely like we don't know yet. I
Yeah.
can't wait until we can actually do the research and test it and see. And I think the way that I think about at least our work at Enamory too is that we really do center the couple therapy experience, right? Chandra and I are couple therapists as long as we have been therapists at all. Like that's been the center and the focus of our work from jump. And I think there is something that is meaningfully different about engaging in any kind of psychedelic healing experience when you are doing it in the context of really good therapy, right? And so for couples, when you're working with a couples therapist who really knows their stuff, right, and who knows how to walk couples through that sort of healing process, which is no small feat, I think that is a really different experience. Than when you augment that with psychedelics. And so for me, the question is sort of less like which psychedelic drug is best and more how can we most effectively use any and all of the psychedelic medicines, right, to help couples in the context of couple therapy. So I think we're in agreement there.
Well, I would add though that when I tell people that we're working together on an MDMA couples therapy study,
Uh-huh.
I hear so many stories of people who say MDMA saved their relationship or MDMA helped them to love each other deeply. I hear that a lot.
Countless. Countless, almost every single person that we ever talked to about this is like, oh yeah, that saved my that saved my marriage. And it's like, I'm like, oh great, will you call your Congress people? Will you tell them that? Will you write us a
Yeah.
check? Maybe. Yeah. We got another question from somebody who's curious about what the challenges are going to be in running the study at an Amory, and we can maybe talk a little bit more broadly about sort of where we're at and where we're going with that.
Okay. I would say one of the biggest challenges is going to be what is the appropriate outcome measure?
Sure.
So we've talked about it, and you've talked about a relationship satisfaction measure
Hmm.
and how that's kind of a gold standard in the field. However, now this is not with MDMA, but with MDA. I had a girlfriend, and her old lover came back into the picture, and she wasn't sure what to do, whether to stay with me or go with him. And so I said, let's just do MDA together, and you and I will try to sort it out. And we had this whole fantastic night together while we're looking at the stars and thinking about this relationship and thinking about our
Yeah.
visions of the future. And by the morning, it was clear that I was wanting to change the world and do stuff outside, and she was more wanting to have a family setting, and that's what this guy wanted, that she would be better off with him than with me.
Mm.
And so by the morning, we felt that that was our decision. So it was this beautiful kind of breakup in a way, and we've stayed friends, and it was really sweet. So I think that the concern that I have is how does that map out onto a relationship satisfaction measure?
Yeah.
So I think one of the biggest challenges will be what is the proper outcome measure that would consider a decision that we made to split up as a success
Right.
rather than as a failure.
Totally. And I think part of this gets at the nature of what is a relationship and what does it mean to have dysfunction in your relationships, which is that it's multifactorial, right? Like, there's all kinds of things. There probably isn't just one outcome measure. And unlike treating something like depression or PTSD, which we have defined as a clinical syndrome or a clinical diagnosis that has symptoms. And so, like, we all agree that the best outcome is reduce those symptoms, right? Don't meet criteria for that diagnosis anymore. Relationship functioning is just much broader and more complex, and it sort of encompasses more. And so I think in an ideal world, right, if I could wave my magic wand, I would want to sort of say, like, we don't have one outcome measure. We have a constellation of outcome measures that all inform a picture of how is somebody doing at the end of the study. What we really want to see is, does MDMA help people alleviate the strain of relationship distress on their lives, on their families, on their communities? Because we know that being in distressed and dysfunctional relationships and feeling that impact on you, that's really where sort of the deleterious effects come. And for some people, that's going to be improve the functioning and stay in the relationship. For other people, it's going to be leave the relationship. And for others, it's going to be de-escalate, but still remain in contact in some way. And there's probably all kinds of other outcomes too. So I agree with you. I think this is really hard to write into a research protocol. And so it's going to be a big challenge for us to figure out how to clearly define this in a way that's going to satisfy the FDA and the other regulatory agencies, the IRB, but also really capture this construct well that we're interested in.
Yeah, the other part, and I'm curious, you're sort of exploring with various people the idea of process measures
Yeah.
about how people communicate, the style of communication, how open that is. I think that those kind of measures might end up being a primary outcome measure. The quality of communication, which is sort of independent of whether you stay together or not. So I would say that Mary Beth was her name when we did this MDA all night. We had a tremendous quality of communication, and I
Hmm.
actually felt that our conversation became the background, and the movement of the stars at night became the foreground.
Yeah.
Because she would say something, and we would just sit with it for like half an hour, and we'd be really quiet, and we'd see the night go by, and then we sort of reflect back and forth. And so I think that there's a lot of potential in these process measures.
Agreed. Yeah, I think the traditional sort of process measures that we include in couples research tend to be things like coding the words, the type of conversation that people have, right? So we can certainly do that. And now with AI tools, it's even easier to do that. You don't need an army of graduate students staying up till midnight for 6 months in a row to code this anymore. But in addition, we have all of this new technology that's developed to capture other things. You and I have had meetings with folks where What they want to do is capture facial expression as captured on video. And to the extent to which my facial expression is concordant with yours over time and discordant, and how does that predict outcomes, right? We have some colleagues who also look at vocal fundamental frequency, which is the emotional content of the tone of my voice, right? Nonverbal, but tone of voice. And how does that sync and unsync over time? And with other folks who are interested in sort of vagus nerve functioning, vagal nerve tone as a measure of physiological stress, and some other, biomarkers that we can get at just in terms of how people are kind of synced up. And I think there's a lot of really interesting questions about what does it mean to be synced up physiologically and unsynced physiologically, because sometimes you need one person to regulate the conversation back down, and sometimes you really want to be attuned. And so again, this is all just other ways that relationships are complex, but I'm really jazzed about some of these outcome measures too, or process measures, really. Yeah. The other, big challenge I think at Enamory is the fact that we are a tiny little independent research institute, right? We are not connected directly to a big academic institution. And that's on purpose. Chandra and I were building Enamory as an alternative to the mountainous red tape that we were stuck in the academic institutions that we were at previously. So Enamory is designed to function as kind of the self-sustaining, interconnected clinic, training program, and research institute. And the challenge of that, of course, is that it's a lot harder to go for something like NIH funding or DoD funding when you're not part of a big academic institution. And so I think fundraising for us and sort of supporting all of the infrastructure that we are rebuilding, of course, is always a big challenge when you can't get big government, which frankly, who knows how many people are going to be getting big government grants in the future? Who
Right.
knows?
Right.
But we are going to be primarily funded via philanthropic donation and perhaps some small foundation grants as well. So, for folks who are thinking about how to best support this research, truly donate to help these fundraising efforts. If this is something that has personally affected you, that you find meaningful, that you find encouraging about the future, that's a main way to help.
Yeah. I would add that even these small foundation grants come from the people who set up the foundation that have had their own psychedelic experiences. So
Absolutely.
trying to get a grant from a committee that makes a decision that's not composed of people that have done psychedelics, usually what we found is most of the people will say, yeah, it's a good thing, but one or two people will say, this scares me. I don't want to do it. So getting a foundation grant is really, really difficult unless you know the founders or the people that created the foundation. So in a way, even foundation grants are individual grants from specific people. They just do it through their foundation.
For
So
sure.
maybe over time, one hopes that the Republicans who are going constantly on about how population is declining and, you know,
Right?
you would think that they
Support
want
MDMA. Let's make more babies.
to have more, successful relationships and
That's
people want
right.
more families. And you would think that there
That's
should
right.
be government grant. The other thing I'll add that's frustrating for people to realize is that we have MAPS did start a public benefit pharmaceutical company, and it's off on its own. It's still negotiating with FDA about making MDMA into a medicine with therapy for PTSD, but they see the work as couples therapy, particularly without a diagnosis.
Hmm.
And then the idea of suing the FDA to try to get them to approve for wellness is something they don't want to have anything to do with
Yeah.
whatsoever. So
Yeah.
you would think that the pharma company that's developing MDMA for PTSD would think, oh, okay, couples therapy, let's do that. But I do not think that there will be money forthcoming from the pharma company,
Right.
at least for some time, for couples therapy. So it really falls back onto individuals.
Yep. Yep. Well, I think, Rick, we can probably wrap up here. Thank you so much for staying for an extra few minutes. Do you have any
I just
closing
love
thoughts that you want to share with folks
well,
watching?
I'm just laughing because wrapping up with a fundraising appeal, it does kinda make sense.
I mean, I'm trying my best.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe I'll just talk about the slow progress of science of,
Yeah.
how, as I said, I didn't mention this, but I think it's maybe a good way to end. So, there's a new movie called The Odyssey that's coming out, and Anne Hathaway is one of the stars of this movie. So Anne Hathaway, with her husband, have purchased the rights to Anne and Sasha's 2 books, Pikal and Tikal.
Really?
Yes, and they wanna make it into a movie. Anne Hathaway wants to play the role of Anne Shulgin. who really helped pioneer MDMA couples therapy and MDMA therapy
Yeah.
before it even got to Leo Zeff. So I think that this whole field will get a lot more attention over time. And I just think that it's really, it's taken MAPS 40 years to reach this point. It started April 8th, 1986. And I feel the work with you all and trying to start MMA for couples therapy without a diagnosis is like a whole new chapter of really going after what people really care about, even if it doesn't fit into the DSM.
Yeah.
So, and people have suggested that, I guess this is maybe a last question to ask you, but some people have suggested that we use some sort of trivial diagnosis like adjustment disorder or something like that, because you could say maybe people that have challenging relationships, you could qualify as adjustment disorder. But then you're sort of stigmatizing things and you're giving people a diagnosis. And
Hmm.
so, the other response we've got is don't try to squeeze it into the existing system. Let's just do couples therapy without a diagnosis, and you could use relationship distress. So I'm wondering how you think about that.
I think about it both ways, depending, or always depending on the context, right? Like, I agree with you that, like, I do not think that we should let our, like, I think most people in the US would agree that our insurance system, the way that we have health insurance set up, is not ideal. And I don't think that we should let that insurance system set up dictate the way that we think about and define conditions of note, right? And so, like, just because insurance companies won't reimburse unless you have a mental health diagnosis attached to something, that doesn't actually tell us anything about what is true in reality, right? So, like, there's pressure to connect things to a billable diagnostic code, to a diagnostic code that can sort of justify a medical treatment or something like that. And I think that that is fundamentally backwards, right? I think we should let what is true, like, among people's experience kind of matter first and foremost, and not try and squish ourselves into a box. At the same time, there's been a huge body of research demonstrating how incredibly harmful to health, mental health, longevity, economic functioning, community functioning, child well-being, all of these things are profoundly harmed by relationship distress and dysfunction, right? If you are having intimate relationship distress and dysfunction, how many people out there have taken a sick day from work because you had a fight with your spouse that you just, like, couldn't recover from? How many people out there have noticed that you're a worse parent, that your mental health suffers? We know that relationship dysfunction it's associated with all cause mortality. It is associated with cardio metabolic syndromes. Like, it's really bad for our health. And so part of me is sort of like, well, it should get its own diagnostic code that should be taken as seriously as something like depression, because it has just as much negative impact on our lives. So I don't know. I think, like, one, I think we probably just need more expansive ways of thinking about human flourishing and human well-being than just our DSM and our insurance billing, right? But at the same time, I really do want people to take relationship distress and dysfunction seriously as a condition that is worthwhile to pay attention to and worthwhile to treat.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if we can get some good results from this initial academic pilot study and then
Hmm.
can go to the FDA and say, here's our outcome measures, whatever they happen to be. This is what we want to do. We want to make this into a medicine. And if we challenge the FDA with enough good lawyers and the other things that happen, I think that this idea that once you have FDA approval, it will be easier for insurance companies to cover it,
Yeah.
even if it's without a traditional, billing code.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's true. I mean, right now, when we work with ketamine with couples, it's all prescribed off label. And so that's sort of at the discretion of the prescribers, right? And one of these days we'll have an MD on here to talk about sort of how they think about prescribing ketamine. But yeah, I mean, I think there's pros and cons of the different routes, right? But
Okay, great. Great.
thanks. Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you. I'm so glad that we have you on our team and that you are out here fighting the good fight. It is no exaggeration to say that none of this at all would be happening without your influence over the years. And so we're really grateful for you being here today. And I also just wanted you to know that there's a lot of folks popping up in the chat with deep, deep support of everything that you shared, including the importance of these transitional experiences and rituals throughout adolescence. So
Good,
yeah,
good.
people are on your side. All right. Thanks everybody so much for tuning in. We'll see you soon. Thanks, Rick.
Okay, bye, everybody.